Around the 1st century AD, Germanic was still essentially one language, and even after the migration of the Goths, it stayed a stable and developing dialect continuum for centuries, while it expanded further down on the continent into former Celtic and Latin-speaking areas during the migration period. This video will go through some of the oldest known internal divisions within Germanic, mostly during the Northwest Germanic period, up to around 500 AD, ending with the migration of the Anglo-Saxons and the beginning of the first uniquely Scandinavian sound changes, when the North and West Germanic branches began to become distinct. Around 700 AD, the various Germanic dialects had undergone enough changes to form the recognizable languages we know from the medieval manuscripts, and in turn the forerunners to the modern languages we speak today. There are some developments in Germanic which are seemingly shared between North and East Germanic. It's not sure if these are early shared developments or later parallel developments. The long glides of Proto-germanic, y and w, which were mostly preserved in early West Germanic, became stops in East and North Germanic. Germanic treuaj, Old Norse tryggr, Gothic tryggus, Old English treue. Both North and East Germanic also lost the verb ancestral to English be, German bin or bist, only keeping the cognate to English is and was to form the copula. Another early difference in Germanic is the different developments of the personal pronouns. For example, the first person pronoun goes back to different attested forms in early Germanic. West Germanic ik, Western Scandinavian ek, and Eastern Scandinavian eka. These probably go back to different stressed forms or reinforced forms in Proto-Germanic, which developed separately into the daughter languages. But this is an early development in Germanic, dating back to the 1st centuries AD based on early runic inscriptions. Just like the first person pronoun, the third person pronouns, both in the plural and the singular, developed largely differently in Germanic, with, for example, Old English, Old High German and Old Norse having separate roots for the plural and third person pronouns from different Proto-Germanic roots. It's puzzling why these languages, which are quite closely related, would develop different forms of third person pronoun, but it's possible that this is related to levelings in the verb systems in the languages, increasing the need to have distinct third person pronouns and in reinforcing or innovating new forms. In general, it could be said that, for example, the third person masculine pronoun in West Germanic derives from a form like hes or es, whereas the North Germanic derives from a root han, which is inflected much like a regular adjective. The plural pronouns in West Germanic are fairly similar to those in Gothic, but the third person plural pronouns in North Germanic are derived from the demonstratives. Following the departure of Gothic and other East Germanic speaking groups from the Germanic dialect continuum, the remaining Germanic dialects underwent some common changes. The most notable would be the lowering of stressed e, which probably was an intermediate a, to Northwest Germanic a. There was also a raising of unstressed o to u, and the development of demonstratives with the root thes, with an intervening s sound, ancestral to English this. There are a few more developments shared between North and West Germanic from this period, like, for example, the vowel in reduplicating verbs. But Germanic remained a dialect continuum for so long, which means that it's hard to date these changes. Germanic had, as is preserved in Old English, two separate verbs for to be, wesana and beona. They were kept as separate verbs in Old English with a slight difference in meaning, but in the other Germanic languages, they were either merged, mixed paradigms, or the cognate to English be was completely lost. For example, in Old High German and in turn Modern German, merged with the related forms to English be and Modern German bin, with initial b. Some Old English dialects, along with North Germanic, lost the third person plural form sind and replaced it with an analogical form izun. Gothic, much like North Germanic, completely lost the verb beuna or any traces of it. One of the earliest dialectal splits in Germanic is the development of A-umlaut, which completely left Gothic unaffected, meaning it was a Northwest Germanic change. A-umlaut left very varying outcomes in different dialects, later attested. A-umlaut is the lowering of U and I to O and E when a vowel following an unstressed syllable following the root. This unstressed was oftentimes lost later on in the languages, but left traces in the form of lowering of the stressed U or I. Much of this variation can be attributed to paradigm leveling, which is actually attested to some extent in runic inscriptions, with, for example, forms like horna and kurne. But in general, it could be seen that some dialects favored or developed more backing, more A-umlaut than others. In particular, West Norse and High German show fairly regular outcomes of A-umlaut, whereas East Norse shows it to a lesser extent, and Gutnish completely lacks it. Word final z, that otherwise eventually became r through rhotacism, was usually lost in endings in West Germanic, and was preserved in North Germanic, turning into r in Old Norse. But there were some exceptions. High German did preserve it as r in short monosyllabic words, like the cognate to English we, which was wir in Old High German. However, this is quite irregular and it's difficult to draw a clear line in dialects. Another early sound change is the assimilation of nasals before certain consonants or certain grammatical endings in early Germanic dialects. These developments are largely shared between Anglo-Frisian and Nordic in various degrees. Anglo-Frisian loses n before any fricative, leading to forms like English tooth and mouth. But in Nordic, it only happens before s, leading to, for example, Germanic uns turning into Old Norse os, Old English us. Nordic, Frisian and Northumbrian Old English lose final n in some unstressed endings, like n-stem oblique forms, verbal endings like infinitive, and third-person plural past. Nordic in turn drops even more n's, practically all unstressed n's, or even stressed n's like in prepositions are dropped. Another shared change between Anglo-Frisian and Nordic is the leveling of some grammatical endings. For example, in Old Norse and Old English, all plural datives take regardless of stem, and n-stem nouns level their singular oblique forms to an or un. This is not shared by the other Germanic dialects, like for example Old High German, that keep distinct plural dative forms for different noun classes, like im for I stems, like with for example Old High German gestim, Old Norse gestum. In North Germanic and early High German, there was a strong tendency to monophthongize au and I before r and sh. But the circumstances were slightly different. For example, Germanic I turning to long a in North Germanic. But this happened slightly differently in High German, where it first fronted to a and later to e, leading to Old Norse sar, Old High German ser. This also affected Germanic au before h or r in somewhat similar manner. But there are some exceptions. Old Gutnish does not fully follow this through and keeps au unchanged before historical h. Anglo-Frisian and Saxon mostly turn these diphthongs into monophthongs early on, with some exceptions, particularly with au in Old English, but in general the developments are quite different. Proto-Germanic, or at least Northwest Germanic, is often reconstructed with a secondary e vowel, which is mostly reconstructed for some adverbs, reduplicating verbs, and some loans from Latin. This vowel shows different outcomes in different Germanic languages, but some of them turn it into a rising or centering diphthong, with for example Old Gutnish and Old High German hiar. These forms are also sometimes found in coastal Eastern Nordic dialects like here. Germanic likely had much more dialectal diversity than what we can reconstruct or glean from a few runic inscriptions, Roman sources, and later attestations. Some sources point to unexpected and irregular forms, suggesting dialectal forms of Germanic that simply died out without leaving any descendant dialects. Many speakers of Germanic also migrated to Latin-speaking areas during the fall of the Roman Empire and were assimilated, with their dialects slowly dying out in the process. Examples of these lost dialects could be East Germanic languages such as Burgundian, Vandalic and others, scarcely attested in names and short phrases like Scapia Matja, ja Trinkan in Latin sources. There were also archaic West Germanic dialects like Langobardic, mostly attested through names and loans into Romance. There can also be found some unexpected forms in Elder Futhark inscriptions that don't really line up with later dialects spoken in the same area. Like for example the development of I to E on the Stentoften inscriptions, centuries earlier than the similar East Norse developments of the same Germanic diphthong. There can also be reconstructed irregular para-Nordic forms attested in loans into Sami that don't really line up with the typical North Germanic sound changes, with for example a very different treatment of y in Siverslå within syllables. This seemingly belongs to some lost para-Nordic Germanic dialect in northern Scandinavia.